It was supposed to be a triumphant moment. The culmination of 3 grueling years spent pushing the boundaries of physics, mathematics, and engineering in a desperate race against time. The air in the underground test chamber, located beneath a heavily disguised mountain facility deep in the Reich, was cold, dry, and charged with nervous energy. A small group of the nation's brightest scientists and engineers, men and women whose names were synonymous with breakthroughs in high-frequency electromagnetism and pulsed kinetics, stood assembled. They wore heavy, lead-lined protective smocks, their faces pale in the fluorescent glare. They were staring at a machine, a device they had designed to change the course of the war overnight. The machine itself was a monument to convoluted genius, a mass of tightly wound copper coils, gleaming brass waveguides, and oversized, hand-blown vacuum tubes, all centered around a diamond-shaped focusing aperture. It looked less like a weapon and more like a chaotic piece of modernist sculpture, humming with barely contained power. The object of the test lay 50 meters away, a thick, hardened steel alloy plate, equivalent to the armor of the newest enemy heavy tanks. The tension was suffocating. Every breath, every click of a relay switch, seemed magnified in the cavernous room. The lead engineer, Professor Elias Voss, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his profound introversion, stood at the primary control console. He ran a final check of the power coupling, his hands moving with the practiced, precise movements of a master conductor. Main charge stabilization at 88%, called out the chief technician, his voice shaking slightly. Flux field integrity nominal. Engage primary sequence, Voss whispered, his voice dry. A high-pitched, almost musical whine began to build from the apparatus, escalating rapidly past the range of human hearing. The air began to smell of ozone, and a faint, sickly blue corona danced around the copper coils. The lights in the chamber dimmed momentarily as the machine drew a colossal, almost unsustainable surge of power from the massive underground generators. Then came the climax, a single, silent discharge. There was no explosion, no flash of fire, only a momentary shimmer in the air, as if the space between the device and the target had momentarily crumpled. The power dropped immediately. The humming ceased. Silence returned, deeper and heavier than before. The team waited, their eyes fixed on the target plate. A plume of vapor, smelling faintly of burnt metal and dust, rose from the steel. The chief technician, breaking the silence, grabbed a Geiger counter and cautiously approached the target. He didn't need to look at the reading. He stopped dead 5 feet from the plate. The heavy, 3-inch thick alloy plate, which should have shown a scorch mark or perhaps a small, heat-stress fissure, was perfectly intact on the surface. But running straight through its center was a hole, not melted, not blasted, but vaporized. The edges were perfectly smooth, displaying no evidence of impact, high heat, or fragmentation. It was a circular absence. The target material simply ceased to exist along the weapon's trajectory. No one clapped. No one cheered. The test had been successful, far beyond any theoretical projection they had budgeted for. Voss slowly pushed away from the control console. His face, usually a mask of intellectual focus, was etched with a terror that stunned the entire team. He looked at the impossible hole in the steel and whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. "We made a mistake. This shouldn't exist." The room fell silent, a silence of shared dread. Because the test proved something terrifying. The weapon worked too well, far beyond what its creators believed was technologically possible, utilizing principles they did not yet fully understand. In that moment, the elite engineers who built it became the first people afraid of it. Chapter 2. The Secret Project Born from Desperation. To understand the profound fear that gripped Professor Voss, we must look back 2 years, to the desperate crucible that forged this nightmare. By 1942, the tide of the war had shifted decisively against the Axis power. The Eastern Front was devouring men and materiel. The industrial heartland was being systematically reduced to rubble by the unrelenting Allied bomber fleets. Factories were bombed, critical supply lines were collapsing, and the enemy was pushing closer every month, fueled by an inexhaustible industrial output. In the bunker complex beneath the Chancellery, the High Command was consumed by a fanatic belief in the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon. Not just better tanks or faster aircraft, but a scientific leap so radical that it could instantly negate the enemy's numerical superiority. It was Reichsmarschall Gunther von Kleist, a high command official known for his brilliant, if terrifying, strategic foresight, who issued what became the most frightening and ambitious order of the war. He called it the Edict of Zero Point, demanding a tool that could reset the clock on physics. Von Kleist's order was chillingly simple: create a weapon so advanced the enemy cannot understand it, or fear will do the rest. He needed a system that did not rely on conventional ballistics, explosives, or even known forms of energy. He demanded a device that operated on principles outside the immediate comprehension of the enemy's own scientists, a technology so alien that simply knowing it existed would induce paralysis and terror. The team in the mirror, a team of elite engineers, theoretical physicists, and materials experts, was assembled in a remote, heavily guarded laboratory complex hidden in the Harz Mountains. The facility was codenamed Bauwerk K, Construction Site K. The core of the team was dominated by physicists who had been working on high-energy particle acceleration and magnetic resonance, fields that were then in their infancy. They were given unlimited resources and absolute autonomy, but only one terrifying directive: produce a result within 3 years. The project was given a deliberately misleading name so that, even if documents were captured, no one could possibly guess its purpose: Program Hollenspiegel, the Hell Mirror. The engineers believed they were designing nothing more than an experimental electromagnetic targeting device that used high-frequency radio waves to disrupt enemy radar and potentially overload the primitive electronics of approaching bombers. The official cover story was Project Kronos, a new type of advanced radar jammer. Professor Elias Voss, the project's intellectual leader, genuinely believed he was working on creating a focused, non-lethal, high-energy electromagnetic pulse (EMP). He thought the maximum effect would be the temporary disabling of engine magnetos or the fusion of radio components. Their design philosophy was rooted in the theoretical work of a disgraced Austrian scientist who had theorized that extreme, precisely modulated high-frequency EM energy could induce a localized resonance collapse in specific materials, a localized structural failure at the atomic level, achieved by vibrating the target material's constituent molecules at their precise, harmonic frequency. The design they built was a massive, single-pulse generator designed to achieve this specific frequency and focus. They were wrong, profoundly and terrifyingly wrong. The geometry of the unknown. The key to the Hollenspiegel was not the energy source, it was a standard high-capacity pulse generator, but the focusing array. The diamond-shaped aperture Voss had designed was composed of a newly synthesized ferrite crystal matrix that was incredibly difficult to grow and stabilize. The original math for this array, which Voss had dismissed as having too many variables to be practical, predicted that the focused beam would not only achieve resonance collapse but would also create a momentary, highly localized spatial distortion around the beam's path. Voss had compensated for this distortion in his calculations by factoring in energy loss. He expected that 90% of the energy would be lost in the atmosphere before reaching the target. He calculated that, at best, the weapon might achieve a shallow penetration of the steel plate, requiring several successive pulses to breach it. But the test proved the atmospheric loss was minimal. The ferrite crystal array, perhaps due to a purity they could not intentionally reproduce, had focused the energy not just effectively, but perfectly. The energy beam that slammed into the steel plate was not merely a wave of electromagnetic radiation. It was a hyper-focused pulse of pure vibrational energy that struck the target's atomic structure and instantly pushed the molecules past their stability threshold. The result was the impossible whole, a clean, surgical removal of matter, suggesting that the material had not been destroyed, but disassembled. In that instant of the successful test, Voss realized that the theory he had dismissed as academic excess, the spatial distortion, was not an anomaly, but the core mechanism. His weapon wasn't destroying targets, it was momentarily unzipping the molecular bonds of the target material by creating an infinitesimal, temporary pocket of non-space along the beam's path. The weapon didn't just exceed its design parameters, it operated on a principle that their own science could not yet fully explain, bordering on theoretical physics that had been deemed decades away from realization. This was no mere battlefield tool. It was a scientific accident. And as Professor Voss stared at the vaporized hole in the steel plate, he understood what von Kleist had truly ordered, a weapon that could be fired only once, because its full power was too frightening even for its creators to contemplate. The Hell Mirror had reflected back not an image of the enemy, but the terrifying power of the unknown. And the engineers who built it were now trapped in the chamber with the monster they had inadvertently created. The initial fear of the Hollenspiegel, the discovery that it could surgically vaporize steel, was quickly overshadowed by the growing dread over how it achieved this impossible feat. Professor Elias Voss and his team were not just dealing with a breakthrough, they were dealing with a catastrophic failure of prediction. The machine's efficiency had been grossly miscalculated. The core of Project Hellmirror was rooted in a radical concept, a weapon that didn't fire anything in the traditional sense, but instead used directed energy bursts to disable, ignite, and scramble enemy systems from miles away. It was a theoretical physicist's dream of pure, non-kinetic force. To create this nightmare, the engineers had been forced to become desperate alchemists, fusing advanced, high-risk components into a single, highly unstable system. The genius was in the assembly, the madness was in the reliance on synergy they could neither model nor guarantee. The 4 pillars of the hyper-weapon. The machine was built upon 4 technological pillars, each borrowed from a different, specialized field of wartime research. The magnetron core, the heart. The team utilized a specialized prototype magnetron, the heart of the system. This was a vacuum tube device capable of generating high-power microwave pulses, conceptually similar to the ones developed for early radar systems. However, this magnetron was tuned to a hyper-frequency band that was exceptionally unstable, chosen specifically because theoretical models suggested it was the most likely frequency to cause molecular resonance in metal alloys and fuel vapors. Running this magnetron for more than a few seconds was a high-wire act, guaranteed to generate dangerous internal heat. The hyper-frequency amplifier, the voice. To push the magnetron's output to a weapons-grade level, the team designed a custom hyper-frequency amplifier array. This was a fragile, complex cascade of specialized ceramic and glass vacuum tubes, cooled by a constant flow of chilled inert gas. In any other application, such an amplifier would be deemed grossly over-engineered, but here, it was demanded to function at the very threshold of thermal breakdown. Its purpose was to take the magnetron's raw pulse and sculpt it into a singular, overwhelming wave. The focusing dish, the eye, the centerpiece was the parabolic focusing dish. It required near-perfect machining and was coated with the unique ferrite crystal matrix that Voss's team had painstakingly synthesized. The shape and purity of this dish determined the final beam's coherency. Any flaw in the parabola would scatter the energy harmlessly. The success of the first test proved this dish was operating with an unforeseen, almost quantum-level precision, focusing the energy with an efficiency that violated the team's initial calculations on atmospheric degradation. The power cell, the Fury, providing the instantaneous, colossal energy for the pulse, was a bank of heavily modified, high-capacity lead-acid cells designed for submarine batteries. These batteries were built for quiet, prolonged, low-amp discharge to power a U-boat underwater. Here, they were brutally forced to deliver their entire, life-giving charge in a catastrophic 2 to 3 second burst. This extreme energy draw was so sudden and violent that the power cables were constantly stressed, heating and cooling with every brief test run. Individually, each component was almost harmless, representing separate, controlled experiments. The magnetron was a powerful transmitter, the dish, an expensive mirror, the amplifier, a complex radio component. Together, they became the Hollenspiegel, an electromagnetic firehose the engineers could barely control. The moment of runaway. Professor Voss, desperately trying to prove the machine could be tamed, ordered a second test designed to measure the weapon's effective range and anti-electronics capability. This was not a destructive test, but a stability check. The goal was to fire the pulse at a reduced power setting, directed at a bunker filled with sensitive measuring equipment, including specialized electrometers and high-speed thermal sensors. Voss had programmed the pulse for 1/4 power and a duration of 4 seconds, a seemingly safe envelope. The team watched from a shielded observation gallery, their fingers nervously pressed to the emergency cutoff switches. The whine began, climbing to an almost painful pitch. The air in the test chamber began to hum, and the lights dipped once more. The pulse fired. Instead of the controlled, subdued flash Voss expected, the machine responded with a terrifying, self-generated violence. A brilliant, white-hot arc erupted from the terminal block of the hyper-frequency amplifier. The copper power cables connecting the power cell to the magnetron melted instantaneously, snapping like burning thread and fusing the molten metal to the floor. 2 technicians, caught in the sudden, savage magnetic discharge, were violently thrown several feet backward, slamming into the concrete wall, knocked unconscious by the pure, kinetic jolt of the uncontrolled EM field. And then came the horrifying proof of the weapon's self-amplifying nature. The sudden, catastrophic release of uncontrolled energy was not contained by the test chamber. It escaped as a colossal, non-directional electromagnetic pulse. Every engine in the vast underground test yard stalled simultaneously, the massive external diesel generators, the small utility trucks, and even the staff sedan parked 400 meters away that was not connected to the power grid. The phenomenon was impossible. The pulse had short-circuited every running internal combustion engine within its wide, uncontrolled radius. The sudden silence that descended on the sprawling underground facility was deafening, a silence that screamed of catastrophic failure and terrifying success. 10 times the output. Voss and his surviving team scrambled to stabilize the power grid and check on the injured. The analysis of the melted components and the surviving data logs was chilling. The weapon had not only fired at full power, it had achieved a brief, uncontrolled thermal runaway. The specific combination of the hyper-frequency amplifier and the ferrite focusing dish had reacted to the magnetron's initial energy burst by drawing in ambient electromagnetic energy and multiplying the output. The device had reached nearly 10 times the predicted output, a figure that should have vaporized the entire machine itself. The reason it didn't was only that the power cables had melted, cutting the energy supply just before total structural failure. The engineers stared at the melted copper and the blank screens of the dead engines, realizing the full, awful truth. They had unlocked something they did not fully understand. The Hollenspiegel was not a linear technology. It operated by exploiting an unknown harmonic relationship between massive directed energy and the fundamental electromagnetic field of the surrounding environment. The machine wasn't limited by the power they fed it, it was limited only by the energy it could draw from the world around it. The Hell Mirror had demonstrated the terrifying potential of unlimited, uncontained power. Voss now understood that they had not built a weapon, they had built a scientific accident that risked tearing the fabric of their own technological reality apart. The catastrophic failure of the stability test, where the machine achieved 10 times its predicted output and shut down every engine in the subterranean complex, should have triggered a complete moratorium on program Hollenspiegel. To the engineers, it was proof of an unstable scientific accident. To the high command, desperate and clinging to the illusion of technological supremacy, it was proof of an unparalleled, miracle weapon. Against the strident protests of Professor Elias Voss and his demoralized team, Reichsmarschall von Kleist ordered the machine be prepared for an immediate final field trial, a live-fire demonstration to prove its utility as a game-changer on the Eastern Front. The engineers were given 48 hours to repair the melted cables and prepare the power cell for a single, final, guaranteed shot. The device was surgically extracted from its underground cradle, a task requiring specialized handling due to residual electromagnetic radiation, and mounted onto the flatbed of a heavily modified, self-powered Opel Blitz truck. The truck, designated the Iron Hand, was protected by lead shielding and equipped with an emergency override mechanism. The final test site was a desolate, frozen ravine far from any human habitation, simulating a distant battlefield. The target zone stretched for almost a kilometer, meticulously arranged with mock enemy assets. Old Soviet tank engines, stripped from captured T-34s and mounted on stands, running on low-grade fuel. Captured American communications vans, equipped with operational radio and telegraph gear. A hidden fuel dump of high-octane gasoline, strategically covered to mimic a battlefield depot. Hardened steel plates and concrete bunkers placed at varying ranges from 50 to 800 meters. The entire engineering team watched the trial from a distant, reinforced concrete bunker, their faces grim. They were no longer scientists excited by possibility, they were observers of a bomb they couldn't fully disarm. The shimmer and the strike. The order was given at 1400 hours. The command was simple. Fire one pulse, full duration. Lieutenant Klaus, the same operator from the thermal runaway test, sat sweating inside the shielded truck cabin. His hand trembled as he manually engaged the power cell switch. He knew he was the only thing between the machine and total destruction. For a moment, a terrible, silent moment, nothing. The silence stretched, fueled by the memory of the magnetron's failure in the previous test. Then, the air above the focusing dish began to shimmer. It wasn't smoke or heat, it was an optical distortion, a momentary, localized blurring of the atmosphere caused by the immense density of the focused energy pulse. The energy was flowing, channeled with perfect, horrifying efficiency by the ferrite matrix. The effects manifested across the kilometer-long target zone in a terrifying, near-simultaneous cascade. Systemic engine death. At 400, 600, and 750 meters, the three running aircraft engines sputtered, whined, and died simultaneously. The electromagnetic pulse had penetrated the engine casings and instantly fused the copper windings of the magnetos and the engine timing relays. They were dead not from impact, but from a calculated, systemic neurological shock. Electronic scrambling and combustion. The communications van at 500 meters erupted in a small, internal burst of fire. The high-frequency energy had overloaded every single circuit, antenna, and receiver coil, causing the equipment to overload and burn from the inside out. The radio system was not jammed, it was obliterated. Spontaneous ignition. The most alarming event occurred at the hidden fuel dump 650 meters away. There was no direct spark, no shrapnel, and no heat transfer. Yet, the air over the depot cracked with a loud th-whump, and the volatile fuel vapors trapped inside the storage drums ignited instantly. The resonance collapse mechanism had focused enough energy to cause spontaneous, bulk combustion of the fuel vapors. A massive, delayed fireball rose into the cold sky. Molecular failure. And finally, the structural proof. The heavy steel plate, positioned 50 meters away, did not vaporize as in the first test. Instead, the incredible, uncontained energy pulse subjected it to a thermal shock so extreme that the surface began to glow cherry red instantly, followed by a sickening, audible ping as the internal crystalline structure failed. The armor plate was ruined, not by fire, but by instant, uneven molecular stress. The abyss reflected. The scene was one of total, devastating chaos. The engineers in the bunker stared, not at a success, but at a scientific horror show. The weapon's effects were not confined to a single target, they were holistic and systemic. "It is not focused," shouted Dr. Helmut Brand, wiping sweat from his brow. "The radial leakage is too high. We are causing an effect far beyond the beam." The fear was visceral. Lieutenant Klaus, seeing the results of his one pull of the switch, the three dead engines, the burning van, the exploding fuel dump, threw his hands up. He disconnected the charging cables and refused to fire it a second time, abandoning the command post in the truck. He staggered back toward the bunker, his face a mask of revulsion and shell shock. Later, in his frantic, hidden diary entries, Dr. Brand distilled the team's terror into a single, chilling sentiment. "It is not a weapon. It is a force we barely hold by a cable, and its will is not ours. The moment it activates, it becomes an engine of pure, uncontained chaos." The device wasn't just unpredictable, it was fundamentally uncontrollable. The hyper-frequency pulse, once released, reacted violently with specific materials across an enormous, uncontrolled field. If deployed on the Eastern Front, it could disable an entire Soviet tank column, but it could just as easily cause the fuel tanks of a nearby German panzer division to explode, or fry the radio network of a supporting German artillery battery. It could kill friendly forces as easily as enemy ones. The order and the protest. But the high command, represented by a single, icy-cold colonel who had witnessed the trial from a safe distance, saw only the impossible results: 3 dead engines, an incinerated radio post, and a spontaneous explosion at 650 meters. The collateral damage was irrelevant, the potential was absolute. The colonel approached Professor Voss, his voice clipped and triumphant. "Professor, congratulations. The weapon is deemed operational." He ordered immediate deployment of the single prototype to the Eastern Front, targeting a critical sector where the Soviets were deploying vast mechanized forces. Voss's team was instructed to prepare for field operations within 72 hours. The engineers, led by Voss, finally snapped. This was not a weapon, it was a doomsday machine that guaranteed self-immolation. Voss launched a furious, desperate protest, a rare and risky challenge to the authority of the High Command. He argued the ethical and tactical impossibility of deploying an unstable, system-wide destructive force. "Sir, we cannot control the radius," Voss pleaded. "We have no shielding solution. It is as likely to detonate our own supply depots as it is the enemy's." The colonel looked at him with disdain. "Professor, the front is collapsing. Our fate is already sealed if we do not act. The enemy's fear of the unknown is a greater weapon than its controlled use. Deploy it. If we destroy the Soviet advance, the loss of a few friendly trucks will be a tolerable sacrifice." The engineers refused to back down. They stalled, argued about the need for heavier shielding, demanded more stable power couplings, and insisted on further testing, anything to delay the deployment of their monstrous creation. They were not trying to save the enemy, they were trying to save their own army from a self-inflicted scientific wound. And that protest, that final, desperate act of scientific conscience and fear, may have saved countless lives on both sides of the conflict. Because the fate of Program Hollenspiegel would ultimately be decided not on the battlefield, but in the dark, smoky halls of bureaucracy, where science fought a final, hidden war against fanatic desperation. This is the fifth substantial installment of the long-form narrative for Program Hollenspiegel, the Hell Mirror, focusing on the engineers' final, defiant act of resistance against the deployment of their unstable weapon and its ultimate destruction. I will maintain the cinematic, documentary style and bring the narrative to a powerful climax. The atmosphere in the secure facility at Bowerk K was no longer one of scientific inquiry, but of a tense, internal siege. The High Command had issued a direct, unequivocal order. The Hollenspiegel prototype was to be loaded onto the Opel Blitz transport truck and sent under heavy guard to the collapsing Eastern Front within 72 hours. The order was signed personally by Reichsmarschall von Kleist. To the generals, this was the ultimate strategic gamble: deploy the terrifying, uncontrollable force to paralyze the massive Soviet armored thrust and buy time for the Reich. To the engineers, however, this was an order for collective suicide. They had calculated the instability of the weapon's hyper-frequency amplification system. If jostled on a muddy road, or subjected to even a minor electrical short, the device could trigger a full thermal runaway and self-detonate. The resulting catastrophic energy release would vaporize the convoy, destroy everything within a kilometer radius, and instantly expose the existence of the weapon to the enemy, allowing them to capture the remains and reverse engineer the technology. On the morning the prototype was scheduled to be transported, a freezing, clear day that seemed to mock the impending chaos, the engineers prepared for their final, desperate stand. The code of refusal. Professor Elias Voss, the weapon's chief architect, took an action that was not only insubordinate but a direct act of treason against the High Command. He refused to hand over the activation codes and the intricate manual sequencing key required to power up the system. The prototype was not a simple artillery piece. It was a complex, multi-stage particle accelerator that required a precisely timed digital and mechanical sequence to fire safely, or, as safely as possible. Voss and his two most trusted technicians, Dr. Brand and Dr. Hoffman, were the only ones who knew the complete, 11-step protocol. Voss stood guard at the entrance to the shielded hangar, facing down the colonel who had been assigned to the transport detail, a veteran SS officer named Colonel Brandt, whose impatience was palpable. "Professor Voss," Brandt barked, his face tight with anger. "The deployment order is absolute. Hand over the activation key and step aside. We are moving this weapon to the front. Now." Voss held up the small, heavy metal box containing the master key and the sequencing encryption. "Colonel, I will not. The power cell remains unstable. The ferrite focusing dish is compromised from the last test. Any road shock could trigger a full resonance discharge. This device will detonate, vaporizing your entire convoy and everyone within 1,000 meters. It is a danger to us, not the enemy, in its current state." Brandt, a soldier who understood only chain of command, drew his pistol. "You are defying a direct order from the Reichsmarschall. That is a capital offense, Professor. I will not ask again." Voss did not flinch. "I am upholding the integrity of a program you do not understand, Colonel. If you attempt to force the deployment without the proper stabilization sequence, you will destroy one of the only chances the Reich has to hold the East. You will not fire it, and you will not move it." The line drawn in the sand. The standoff was tense, played out beneath the cold gaze of the massive, ugly weapon mounted on the truck. But the engineers stood behind Voss. Dr. Brandt, still haunted by his diary entry, and Dr. Hoffman, the team's materials expert, stepped forward. "The professor is correct," Hoffman stated. "I cannot guarantee the structural integrity of the magnetron's housing after the meltdown. Transporting it is a death sentence." For the first time in the entire lifespan of the project, the engineers, who had often fought viciously over theoretical minutiae, were united. They had crossed the professional line into moral rebellion. Their unified stance was based on one terrifying, shared truth: this weapon is more dangerous to us than to the enemy. Their scientific oath, their dedication to understanding and controlling the laws of nature, outweighed their military obligation. They refused to unleash a phenomenon they could not contain upon their own retreating forces. Colonel Brandt, facing a silent, unyielding wall of scientific authority, realized he could not simply shoot the only 3 men who knew how to operate the weapon. The delay was unavoidable. He had to appeal to higher authority. The argument over the Hollenspiegel's deployment began its slow, grinding ascent through the rigid chain of command. It required multiple, high-level confirmations and appeals that bounced between the distant military command and von Kleist's bunker. The bureaucracy, usually ruthlessly efficient, was now snarled by the fundamental incompatibility of the problem, a weapon too powerful to use. This delay, bought by Voss's courage and the collective protest of his team, was the only thing that ultimately saved the world from the weapon. By the time the argument reached the very top of the chain of command, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had devolved into total chaos. The Soviet advance, which the Hollenspiegel was meant to stop, had overwhelmed the German defenses in the region. Enemy forces were now advancing directly toward the region encompassing Bauerk K. The strategic calculus changed instantly. The fear of Soviet soldiers capturing the hyper-advanced technology, the magnetron, the ferrite crystals, the focusing dish, and harnessing the weapon for their own use, instantly outweighed the desperation to deploy it. The orders that crackled back down the line were swift, blunt, and irreversible. Program Hollenspiegel was to be destroyed immediately. The engineers, led by Professor Voss, carried out the demolition themselves. This was their final, grim task, the assassination of their own genius. There was a sense of profound, heavy relief. They weren't destroying a chance for victory. They were dismantling a massive, self-destructing threat. Burial under the mountain. The process was methodical, designed not just to destroy the machine, but to bury the evidence of its existence forever. Extraction and placement. The Hollenspiegel prototype, still mounted on the Iron Hand truck, was driven back into the main, deep underground test chamber. Strategic charges. The engineers placed powerful demolition charges not on the machine itself, which might trigger the magnetic instability, but around the test chamber's structural supports and the ceiling directly above the prototype. The final pulse. Professor Voss initiated a sequence that triggered a final, uncontrolled, partial pulse from the machine, just enough to completely fuse the core magnetron and the highly sensitive ferrite focusing dish into a single, unusable mass of molten metal and ceramic. Demolition. The powerful charges were detonated, collapsing the massive concrete ceiling and the upper structural beams. The main test chamber was buried under tons of concrete and rock, creating a massive, stable subterranean grave. The entrance tunnels to Bauerk K were then sealed and blown up, disguised to look like a simple mine collapse. The weapon, too powerful and too dangerous to be allowed on the battlefield, was effectively erased from history by its own creators. The only surviving pieces were a few melted power cables, a handful of inscribed technical schematics, which were deliberately left ambiguous, and a few fused components, chunks of magnetic metal and ceramic that had withstood the thermal runaway. These melted pieces were placed in heavily guarded military storage, classified at the highest security level, where they would remain, never displayed in any museum, serving only as mute, terrifying proof of the forces the engineers had barely managed to contain. Professor Voss and his team were immediately transferred to unrelated projects and sworn to absolute, lifetime secrecy. They were neither punished nor rewarded. They were simply removed from the terrible knowledge of the Hollenspiegel. The weapon that could have changed the war, by destroying both sides simultaneously, was never fired in anger. It remains a dark, forgotten chapter of advanced physics, a monument to the moment when its inventors realized that true terror lay not in the enemy, but in the uncontrollable, unintended power of their own genius.